Namaste. My name is Neelima. Welcome to Reflections Along the Way podcast, where you will be listening to reflections from experiences and learnings along my life's journey. Hi everyone. So today we are talking to a very dear friend of mine, Nikhil Acharya, who I've known for about maybe a little more than 15 years. And I'm so excited to have you on here, Nikhil, because I've always found you very, very interesting, very creative, and a misfit in a good way.
I'm glad it's a good way, Neelima.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me here. I'm really not that old, but yes, we haven't known each other a long time.
You're not old at all. When I met you, you were like maybe
A
just in
baby.
your teens. I don't know. Maybe you were
Yeah,
19,
I,
20.
I, I'm going to say 20, 21. Pretty young, pretty brash, pretty didn't know what he was doing.
I was
Yeah.
older in age, but probably mentally I was in your level of because I
I
had
think
no idea.
I was probably older in my thinking, so we
Exactly.
probably matched because of that. So
The first time we met was when we started D Cube,
yeah.
and you had come to cover the opening of the store because you were working as an intern in a local magazine, if I remember right, right? Is that the first
Yeah.
time?
Well, I was writing for this magazine. Well, I had a column, like there's lots of random things around it. Yeah, it was because of that, really, that we met. And I was a bit sort of, okay, this is a pretty cool store for the city we were in. And that was the start of a beautiful friendship.
Yes, it was absolutely. And it evolved into so much more than that. And we worked on different projects, but not only work wise, it was so enjoyable because you were always there when I needed you. Like I said, I didn't know what I was doing also in a way. We were just exploring and like trying to get new ideas into the city and new products. And sometimes I felt kind of lost. And you were one of those people who was always there to just have a conversation to see where we were going to reflect on stuff. And
I actually think the best people are lost, though, Neelima. Like, I've really come to sort of embrace that lostness because it's when you're lost in that way that you're not kind of repeating someone else's stuff. Like, I think creativity and a lot of other stuff, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but, lost is underrated. I am actually very suspicious of people who aren't lost because how do you know? I mean, who told you where the destination was? Because if you think you know where your destination is, you probably are overestimating the control you have on your journey, and or you have been sold a destination you probably don't even know you want to go to. So actually, I warm sort of greater extent to people who are quote unquote lost.
it didn't seem that way when I was experiencing that. But once I got through that phase, I realized that it is a very necessary place to be in if we really want to figure out stuff and, just proceed with a more clearer, some idea of where we want to go next, sort of thing.
I guess, like, for context, it's important for both of us to sort of acknowledge that we were experimenting with what we wanted to do. We both had a creative vision with what we wanted to do. And I guess the nature of some of that is having a lot of belief in your voice, right? Because at the end of the day, creativity requires belief in yourself and your voice. I think we definitely had that in common. I felt like we were very much aligned on that.
It's a form of self expression, I think, also. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah. It's everything from therapy to expression to processing, I suppose. Everything around you. Yeah,
yeah.
it's one of those things that I think we all sort of were, predisposed to do it anyway. If you kind of look at just in general sort of human beings, like, we've always created our way out of everything. To me, that tells me that's really fundamental to who we are. And you kind of think about stories and you think about finding something to create or think your way out of something. It just has always been the case. It's one of those things that I think it almost defines us as a sort of species and as sort of guardians of this planet.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a nice way of putting it. And it makes perfect sense also. I know a little bit about what you studied and your journey as such, but tell us a little bit about where you grew up, how you evolved into this amazing creative person doing so
This,
many
this,
different stuff.
this mess of a human being is what you mean, Ilana. Okay, I get you. Just being too polite to call me that. I grew up in a couple of places. So I grew up, in India. I spent some time in the UK. I spent some time in the US. I spent some time in Scotland. So there was sort of a lot of moving around. But I guess in the context of what we're talking about, I think it's important for me to say that my parents are very creative people. I grew up in a really creative household. Even though both my parents had a very buttoned up job, they were very creative people in that they both loved the arts. Yeah, I grew up with a lot of appreciation for the arts, first and foremost, actually. My father still does caricature and cartoons. My mother does oil painting. So it's sort of, there was always this idea of the arts is something that is quite amazing. And it was never sort of said, but it was definitely appreciated. So it wasn't like I had to really go far to find that sort of inspiration, I suppose. So I was very, very lucky. And actually, it's only something that you kind of think about when you are older and you kind of meet other people who didn't have that experience and you're thinking, oh, right, well, I had that experience and I was very, very lucky and privileged to have that experience. So I think it began there really. And then my journey into story really began when I was quite young and I wrote something that ended up winning something nationally. And that was the first time that something I just sort of on a slight whim had done that actually did. I know this sounds like a humble brag, but it's not humble brag because it was genuinely like, oh, I guess I'm not terrible at that. And I think that sort of fueled it a little bit more. I know I'm being very obtuse in terms of telling people what I've actually done, but basically studied economics and business. But I always had this Jekyll and Hyde-ness about me where I was, I always loved that other side as well. I'm very analytical and I actually, even now would say I approach creativity with a fairly analytical kind of brain, as we both know from,
I noticed
but
that with you clearly. Like you are very creative, but you also do it with a very analytical, logical, with a purpose. Like, what are we doing this for? That idea is very clear in you.
yes, yeah, and I think that's a really interesting sort of thing to dwell on because for me, what I'm doing now actually is really the kind of the combination of all of that stuff because I had this sort of background, for lack of a better word, very logical kind of rational, quote unquote, sort of thinking. But then there was this other sort of stream to my expression, which was much more kind of unbridled creativity, dabbled in film and all of this kind of stuff. So I really sort of enjoyed that. And I think at the end of the day, I've realized through a lot of doing each side that I really want the yin and yang of both of those things in what I do, which is what I do now, this is a long-winded way of saying that what I do now is I work for a small creative studio in London. We do film and we do a bunch of other things. And I do strategy, which is, again, on paper, very sort of analytical and logical, but equally is very creative stuff. And it's all about shaping that creativity and also getting involved in that creative process. So I think I'm definitely one of those people who enjoys both sides of that equation. And I kind of don't like sort of separating those two things because I think the analytical side is really important as well for creativity, actually, to do it well. And there's obviously this other side where you need to kind of ignore some of that. And as you say, sort of self-expression and your voice and all of that stuff is also really, really important. But if you're going to share anything with the world, then there needs to be on some level, you need to want to know who you're kind of sharing it with, and actually almost check the arrogance that some people have of, well, this is me, and this is what I'm creating. Well, that's fine, but equally, this is for somebody else also. You are exposing yourself to somebody else, so you have to think about the other person if you're going to.
Like, how do we connect and convey what we are trying to convey to the other person? If you are sharing it publicly, then that is the purpose, right?
At the end of the day, the greatest gift someone can give you is their time. And if someone can stop and look at something you've made or spend time with something you've created for more than a fleeting second, that's a gift. And you never want to sort of take that for granted. And you always want to sort of, in some way, understand what makes people do that, or at least on the very basic level, appreciate that. There's lots of misconceptions around creativity, but I think one of them is that just because I want to say something, that there's an audience for it, which is not true, actually. Like, just because you have something to create doesn't necessarily mean that someone's out there waiting for you to create.
But I've seen glimpses of all that you've mentioned 15 years ago. Like, I've seen you as a awesome writer, because that's how we started, I think. After that first
Yeah.
meeting, started working on the website, and you were in charge of copywriting. Also, I saw your creativity in the t-shirts. That was awesome also. I have this in me where I don't focus too much on the audience. And you were that voice who would kind of bring that into the conversation. And so all this, I think I've noticed in you, and they all came together, and you found the right career for it, which is awesome.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to hear that you saw glimpses of it, because obviously it takes someone on the outside to sort of say that, like I was very blissfully unaware that that was me. You're absolutely right. Like, I'm very lucky to have found that right balance. And I think it's also come from a lot of chop and change. I'd say it's almost worth sort of exploring each side and finding your right sort of equilibrium, because I realize that this is the equilibrium I want, and when it's upset, I know that it's upset, like when it's too much on the other way. And I'm a massive centrist as a person, and I definitely think the truth is somewhere in the middle. And that's genuinely true. Like, I think that there needs to be a balance. And when that balance is not balanced, it makes me, I feel it. I feel that kind of lack of balance. So I'm very lucky that I found something that lets me balance both the creative side with this analytical slash sort of thinking of sort of what people want.
You're right, though. For an outside person, they view it with a different perspective and different angle. So it seems simpler to kind of see. But for us, as an individual going through that journey, it doesn't seem so clear. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of reflection to come to that point of clarity, to figure out, hey, this is what I want to do, right? I mean, it is a journey that each person probably has to make to get to that point of clarity.
What's also interesting, as you were saying that, is the role of people, because we're not islands. And, every creative sort of endeavor, like as we did with the t-shirts, all of this stuff, it requires other people. Like, I've become more and more, again, suspicious of these sort of geniuses, like this sort of one person who is the font of all creativity. Like, I don't think that actually potentially exists. Like, I've found that actually it's a lot more powerful when you have a bunch of people that you can iterate with. And I think the creative process is actually very iterative. You can have a really good idea and you bounce it off of some other people who you trust. I'm not saying go and ask every single person on the street, but I am saying that this idea, this notion of there's this one person who has all the answers and is this sort of incredibly, and that's creativity from the very broad sense, right? Like, this idea of that genius is, I think, more and more being put to the test, because actually it's collaborative sort of endeavors that bring that thing to life. And even if you do have this genius, that genius can't produce stuff on their own, and whatever that is, like from the creative arts to things that are creative and not, like whatever you want to call it, from vaccines to the most sort of unbelievable art form, you need other people. And it's almost arrogant to think that my lens is the right lens. A lot of people kind of forget that there's other people involved in any creative process. And you think of anything we like creatively, there wasn't just one person normally, you might remember just one person.
Yeah.
But the reality was there was a lot more other people who were involved in making that thing come to life. My feeling is that the route to really good creativity, actually, or to anything that's really nice, is making sure that the people you are involving in those inputs are actually really good people, and letting them kind of do their thing as well. Just as you did your thing, let them kind of do that thing as well, because it has to be collaborative and it needs to be open. And I think when you, and I've seen this where people are very territorial or precious about that stuff, that actually ends up not being very good, because there's a lack of trust in other people. There's a lack of even acknowledgement that actually it requires more than just me to make this amazing thing.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm very happy to be very, very, in a way, vulnerable and open to say, yeah, I can't do this. I don't have all the answers. To me, that's actually coming from a place of strength, not weakness, to say that.
I think this is more generic and not limited to the creative field.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think you're totally right. I think it's more than just a like, it's anything really, as you say, even in every sphere of life, I
mhm.
think the reality is that you are dependent on other people
Yeah.
to sort of make your life that
It's
much
funny
better.
that you brought this up because this is something that I have thought about a lot over the past year. It's always right in front of us, but then sometimes we are so into ourselves thinking that, oh, okay, I'm doing this. I'm like, it's like we're possessive.
Hmm.
We think that we are the only one doing it, but it's actually not. I mean, only when there is cooperation in our ecosystem, in whatever way it is, are we able to produce that in one way or the other, right? And that brings us to the realization how connected we are. And COVID actually is a very good example to show us like how really connected we are with each other.
Yeah, or connected we need to be. But
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear, was there a phase where you felt like that wasn't the case and then you had this sort of realization? Because I definitely felt like went through that kind of transition from like, and I've tried to reflect on where this comes from. At least for me, I feel like there's a lot of sort of idolizing of certain kind of people or anyone who's to say like, well, this is the individual who has the answers. And it's when you kind of strip that back, then you realize like, actually, that's not true. So did you have, I'm curious to hear like where did
Yeah,
that,
for
you,
me, like I've never really had this idolizing of one person.
Mhm.
I used to appreciate certain qualities or virtues in different people, but I never also felt like part of an ecosystem. I didn't make that connection until very recently, that realization. That is really odd. I'm like, after I had that thought, I'm like, why did I not feel this way all the while? It is so clear to me now. Like, only if everybody else around us is doing well and happy can we be happy in a general, in a more generic way also. It took some time because I was so, I think, not self absorbed, but I was like more, I wouldn't spend too much time on thinking about other people. I'm thinking about myself, my thoughts, my ideas. Why am I feeling this? I'm always trying to find solutions in my mind as to what can I do or change to not feel this way that I'm feeling, or to feel the joy or happiness. So I'm less focused on other people actually.
That's really interesting. I can only think of also, very sort of individualistic sort of cultures that, I think there's a kind of East-West divide here where there's a whole kind of narrative that you emancipate yourself. I think specifically about creativity, if we're going to make that a little bit of a theme, is insecurity. Because the thing is that there's a kind of fine balance and a fine line between being the voice that's original and I'm really required for this to come to life
Mm.
versus, oh, I'm actually quite dispensable,
Hmm.
you know? And
Hmm.
that's quite scary because one of the most scary things about creativity and ideas, I suppose, from anything is when am I going to stop having some? Like, is
Hmm.
there a pipeline? Am I
Hmm.
going to sort of just run out?
Yeah.
And I think it takes a while before you kind of learn to trust that actually your lens and the way you look at stuff will sort of be for lack of a better word, like the eternal source of ideas and
Hmm.
viewpoints. So don't
Hmm.
worry too much about are you going to sort of come up against writer's block or are you going to kind of come up against something that will just stop happening?
I
But
can totally
because,
relate to what you're saying in my journey also. So when I started exploring, I felt very insecure also. I didn't have this background, and there's probably that lack of confidence which made me feel insecure at times. Like,
yeah,
how do I find my niche? Like, what am I doing? There's so many people doing this. Like, what am I trying to achieve here? Sort of questions, right? And then after many, many years, it has come to a point like it's really, if we go in that path of trying to see what others are doing and try to compete with that, then we are stuck in that cycle of trying to imitate or trying to see what works. And it's just not liberating. There's no purpose of creativity for me at that point. For me, it's more about bringing out the thoughts or ideas that I am having to share with the world again, so that we have this collective ideas that everyone is experiencing in a genuine, honest way, and not by imitating others, so
Yeah.
that all of us can benefit from it. And I completely agree with you. I don't think any idea is original. I think that ideas are always there. We are not exposed. There's so much in the world. We're just
Yeah.
not exposed to it. And when we think of something that we weren't exposed, we think it's original, but it's
Mhm.
always been there in one form or the other.
It has, and I think what's also interesting about this is I read something a couple of years ago. I think it was really interesting about the death of the hobby. Basically, what this was saying is there used to be a time when people would just do something that they found joy from,
Mhm.
and they didn't really care if they were great at it or not very good at it. You
Mhm.
know, so any like take crafts, take sort of sport, whatever it was,
Mhm.
you kind of just do it, and you kind of intrinsically get fulfillment and joy and you know things from it without pegging yourself as to, oh, actually what I wrote isn't going to get me a Pulitzer Prize, and oh gosh, I'm not going to get shortlisted for an award. You know, there was none of that. You just kind of did what you did for the sake of just doing it. But
Mhm.
actually, in the last few years, or you know, last maybe sort of 5 6 years or so, it's sort of you know evolved into, no, but I need to kind of really be good at it. You know, I can't just do something and be very amateur. It needs to, even though it's a hobby, there is no such thing as a hobby. Like, you know, you need to kind of almost show that you are thriving in it, that you're actually doing quite a good job of it. And I guess, you know, I'm not saying that's true for everyone, but I am saying that there's things that have, I agree with it basically. You know, I read that and I thought there was definite resonance with how, you
This
know, you can't cook a
pressure.
meal anymore and just not like take a picture and say,
Yeah.
oh, how does this compare with a food influencer, and just like, oh yeah, I guess it looks quite good, you know.
This pressure that's built around it. And that comes, I think, again, based on each individual.
Yeah, people are a massive input. The
Yeah.
stuff you consume from a media point of view, your media diet is another input. These are all sort of stimulus slash input
Yeah.
into your brain. And at the end of the day, it's going to firstly impact you, and also it's going to
Sure.
impact what you put out. There's absolutely an input output aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it comes back to how choosy are you about what you're putting in, you
Yeah.
know?
How
Uh,
conscious are we doing that? Like,
Yes, and you know, because mood is just so related to what you consume.
mm-hmm.
A lot of it is autopilot. A lot of it is, I just need to escape. You know, I don't want to make another decision in my day because my day has been full of lots of decisions. So actually, when I put the TV on or if I'm scrolling through something, that's one more decision actually I'm not willing to take anymore. You know, just show me something. Let an algorithm choose that. I don't
Mhm.
really care. Whilst that works, you know, for your mood, and that's really sort of fulfilling that aspect of escapism or whatever you want to call it. A thing that's sort of slightly overlooked is that actually at the end of the day, that is your diet. That is actually going to influence you in some way. And that's fine. You know, I'm not here to sort of say that everyone should be watching really, really esoteric French new wave films all the time that talk about death all the time. Like I'm not talking about that. You know, it goes back to what we're surrounding ourselves with, and it's people, it's things, it's ideas, and it's being a bit more conscious about that, you know. And again, if you can choose the people you are getting inputs from, and you're choosing the type of media diet that is giving inputs to you, then reality is you probably will end up sort of creating something that is going to churn some bits of that out, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Of course, that's also an alchemy of all of that and your own voice and your own experiences and your lived experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to your point around no creator is in an island, right? Like you are creating as a reflection of you, but also the people around you and the things around you. Like, you know, there's context to creation. It's never just in and of itself. It's always within a more macro context.
Yeah.
And again, that's something that I think gets overlooked in
Yeah.
creativity, or again, like it's something that isn't as obvious anyway.
Very interesting. Like, it's very interesting to think about Like we probably have done this unconsciously, some of these things. And to think about the process is very interesting. Like, how does this happen? Like,
Yeah, I mean, this is the I think that this is the biggest fallacy in all of this is that there's this idea that there's a eureka moment, or there's a sort of people just kind of are walking down the street one day and there's a bolt of lightning and they get this aha idea about something.
hmm.
But actually, that's been proven time and time again that that's actually very much the minority. And and yes, of course that can happen. And really, normally that happens from the subconscious level, kind of processing other things. And I'm kind of going back to the same central notion of, a lot of people normally sort of make something really, really great. It's not just that one person walking on the street that gets hit by this sort of spark of absolute genius. You know what? Like that spark could be the spark that starts it. But you're always going to have to stand on the shoulder of giants to be able to sort of make something that is actually pretty incredible. And I think to some of my favorite writers, some of my favorite filmmakers, and just even not just creative, like, not in the creative arts, but just genuinely really interesting things that have come out in the last sort of decade or more, or so, like across the sort of spectrum. And again, it always boils down to the fact that they were collaborative things, and actually that there was a process to it, and actually, I think that's a very unsexy way of looking at it for people. It kind of takes away the magic for some people, which is kind of disappointing, because actually I think it doesn't. Like for me, it actually makes it really accessible, and it actually says, oh, turns out that genius doesn't have to reside in just one person. Turns out that actually there's a process, and turns out that that anyone can give it a go.
Yes.
Which is really actually liberating and empowering in a very different way, because there's that kind of tension between, I don't think I'm creative. Like I've come across this so often, where I've tried to get people to sort of write alongside me or something. And the thing that keeps getting thrown back is, I'm not creative,
Yes.
and I find that interesting on two levels. The first level is that people have self-diagnosed themselves as this thing, which is kind of crazy. Like, I don't know where that came from. And then the second thing is, almost there's this sort of, it's sort of, you're either born with it or you're not. It's like a stupid Maybelline ad, and it's not Maybelline. Like, creativity is not Maybelline. Like you don't have to be. Everyone's born with it, everyone's born with, I think, their own lens and their own way of looking at things. And it's actually craft and resilience that is very different from what makes something a good creative thing or not, and it's not sort of this inborn natural kind of thing that of course there's natural talent. I get all of that, but actually at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to process. A lot of it comes down to craft, like I said, sort of iteration. It's very unlikely that on your first go you will get it right. You have to fail. People can't see this, but I've been drinking off a mug that talks about the embracing the idea of failure often, because that is what actually gets it to a really good place. You fail and you do it quite often, and then that normally gets you to a better place. So there's a lot of, I think, this idea that I'm not this, or I wasn't born with that, or all of this stuff, which actually is completely actually rubbish, if you kind of look at it.
That is very, very true. And this is something I completely agree with you also. Like, even when I didn't feel I was as creative, I always thought that, everybody is capable of it. You just have to put the right effort and right focus, and you will get there at one point or the other. For some person it may be days, for some weeks, for some years, but you can make it happen. This reminds me of one of the interviews that I did when I was in DQ, where with a local paper, and they would ask me, how did you get here? And like, you're so creative. And I'm like, I didn't feel that way also. I was like, no, anyone can do it. Why do
I mean,
you feel it's so special? Like,
yeah, like, you're not wearing a beret, or you don't have a tattoo on your wrist, so how can you be creative?
Yeah. I've experienced this also, right? People will kind of look at somebody and they judge whether they're creative or not, but you can't say that. Inside, what is going on in the mind? Creativity is about finding solutions also at the end of the day. So creativity starts with thinking to start with, right? Which is
Absolutely, and actually, you're totally right that we should conflate that with self-expression, because you can be very creative in your self-expression and you can be incredibly non-creative in your self-expression, and that's not the same thing. And as you say, just that, like, you're creating, you're thinking your way out of a problem, or you're thinking of an obstacle, and you're like, well, how can we be creative and find the bridge that crosses this gulf? It's so loaded, like that word is
yeah.
just so loaded. There's so many sort of connotations to it. There's so many sort of judgments around the people who are supposed to be that and not really that. I definitely read somewhere that there was some sort of weird article that talked about how the thing for the next generation to be the most employable is to be able to show they're creative. And I thought, what an absolute bunch of bollocks, because every generation has had to be creative and has to demonstrate their creativity. So this idea that actually only finally now that employers are looking for creative skills is just absolute nonsense. Like, just because, what is the barometer for that? Are you saying that because you can demonstrate that you can do a good IG story or a TikTok, that's going to be creative? I mean, yes, that's a completely sort of very narrow self-expression sort of definition of it. But really, we're doing this with my sitting here in London and you're sitting where you are, with technology that's been created by some really creative people who decided that they can do this, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And not just one person, again, to note, it took a whole lot of people to make this experience happen right now. And I
Yeah.
think that's what gives me the most hope about everything. Like, I've been very, very, in the face of a lot of worry and where we're all headed, I actually am very bullish about the fact that we've always done this. Like, and yes, maybe some problems will be incredibly unsurmountable, but at the end of the day, I always believe in our ability to, yeah, exactly what you said, like, think our way out of a problem, or look at different routes, look at different bridges, create completely different bridges that we never even imagined would be a bridge. And we're surprised, like, if you kind of again look at where we came as a race, like as human beings, like we've constantly done that. At some point, someone said, actually, I think it will be possible for someone in the US and someone in the UK to be talking to themselves over a computer screen.
Yeah.
Or some people said that would be a
Because they
thing.
imagined that this could
Yeah, they
happen and
imagine
they
that would,
created it. Yeah.
totally, and they imagine that would be a thing. But what is interesting is, like, it required a stretch from reality, right? Like, someone imagined a future and they said, "What if?" And I think that's really powerful, and we should never lose that. We should never ever. We should hold on to that kind
It's
of.
a very, very important point that you brought up. Like anything we see as manifested as a physical reality has come from someone imagining that can happen or that can exist, and they created it, and we see it now.
That to me is the creativity. Like, it's what if. Like, those two words are so powerful to me, because it's and I know I'm veering towards innovation here, but creativity involves that, right? Like, it involves conjuring up worlds, characters, stories, realities that don't exist today.
Yeah.
But if it weren't for people kind of pushing that question of what if, we wouldn't be able to do this, and the world would be a really, really dull place.
And it's always there, like you said, it's not something unique to our, like, generation or our period of time. It's always there. It's always been there. Otherwise, like, how do we even see all these things coming up? And
No, exactly. So that's what gives me a lot of, I think, confidence and hope that actually, and it's not up for me or you or anyone to have these answers yet. I have absolutely nothing but confidence and optimism that there will be answers overall. And look, we already have answers for something that has taken over the world in the last kind of year and a half, and that's been such a testimony to, a lot of brains together, a lot of creative thinking.
Okay, let's delve into another aspect of creativity now. So we've
Sure.
seen like how, like, we can probably create something that's not already there as a solution to ourselves or to other people or to the ecosystem in general. How do you relate creativity to happiness?
Ooh, I can only obviously speak for myself, but I look at it from a standpoint of either escapism or processing sort of what's happening to you, and I find a lot of happiness from that. I know that's not a very straightforward answer, but like for me, I find a lot of joy and happiness from doing those two things. And sometimes it's just immersing yourself in a lot of really good art as well, like a really good kind of creativity. I don't know. I think I'm really, really interested in the human condition. And when other art and other things do that, it makes me really happy. And I guess where that comes from is you feel like you're part of something bigger. You're all kind of connected by this human condition. And I think what's really powerful about creativity, actually, and I'm talking specifically about creative arts here in terms of when you say that, like, I'm thinking of creativity from a standpoint of a story I really like, or a film I really like, or a song actually that let's say I listen to and like, God, this really moves me. It really comes from, I think what's really interesting about that kind of creativity is that it sort of delves into a layer that a lot of society normally doesn't operate on. It kind of digs slightly deeper because it just has to. It needs to almost bring to the fore, I guess, pushes and pulls that exist below the surface level of society. And that's why we connect with it. When you kind of read something and you listen to something that really speaks to you, I think what it's really doing is it's speaking to you in a way that you can't really sort of, you very often won't find a way to do that in society, because there's a kind of undercurrent to everything. And creativity, a lot of good creativity kind of taps into this much more, I guess, base, for lack of a better word, undercurrent. And I think a lot of good creativity can tap into what's really being thought or really being said behind the sort of mask of, well, there's a kind of mask of everydayness, right? And there's a kind of mask of, at least here, I'm talking about the stiff upper lip in England, where you're having an absolutely terrible time, and you absolutely can't say that. You're putting on a brave face and you're doing this. I'm being facetious, but creativity can't do that. It can really sort of do that. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying happiness comes from being authentic. It comes from connecting with something that's really authentic. It connects with something that makes you really, I guess, dwell in, the human condition. And the last thing I'd say about this, and this is going to sound terribly unsexy, is that I actually really enjoy melancholy as well. There's a kind of weird obsession around, I think, like comedy and joyfulness. And I actually like writing a lot of sort of dark comedy when I can. But there's a kind of weird sort of, it's almost like the social contract where, oh, melancholy sounds like a bit of a not cool person to hang out with. Like, I don't really want that in my life. But actually, I find that really weird because I actually consider myself a really happy person. And there's lots been written about this already, but there's a sort of a thermostat, like, a lot of behavioral science will say everyone's born with a thermostat for happiness. And you have a range, and the external circumstances can either take you to the highest point of that range or the lowest point of the range, but you'll never go lower than your range. You'll never go higher than your range. I'd like to believe that I am actually quite blessed with like a fairly all right range and good thermostat for happiness. Like, as in, like, I'm genuinely happy. But what I find really interesting is, like, with creative stuff that's very melancholic, I actually really relish that because it almost makes me connect with a side to me that isn't like my kind of normal happy level. And it's not coming from a denial point of view or like oh, look at me, like not in touch with my melancholic side. Actually, like, I really see that side as well, especially last year, where a lot of stuff was quite dark and quite kind of crazy for a lot of people. I found huge amounts of, happiness in immersing myself in excellent film, excellent writing, excellent just overall creativity, and yeah, I think it can be a real sort of refuge for people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, creativity, like being involved in doing whatever I am doing, actually kind of showed me the path to experiencing this higher level of happiness. What I have observed is when I'm involved in something that I am doing creatively, it kind of calms our mind. So basically, it takes us to a more clear mind where solutions come with much more clarity instead of confusion filling our minds, right? So, and then we have this capacity of thinking more logically, more clearly in terms of what we are trying to solve. So,
Mm,
I think that helps in that way too, especially the doodling and the Zentangling that I do and all. What I've observed is when we are immersed in that art,
yes.
it just clears our mind so much. Basically, when we talk about geniuses or whoever, other people who has these ideas, I think they have the ability to do that because their mind is so clear and they're able to
Yeah.
focus on something so intensely that they are able to convey and portray and communicate that idea so clearly. So that clarity is a really, really good benefit of immersing ourselves in something. When you can call it hobby, you can call it arts, whatever, you know.
That's really interesting where you've like what you brought up also for me that sort of there's a state of flow,
Mhm.
where there's a really interesting behavioral economist. I'm pretty sure this is how you pronounce his name, and it's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which sounds really funny. But he kind of was the first person to really talk about the state of flow.
Mhm.
And he kind of it's that feeling you get when you're doing a lot of repetitive or you're like in the zone, like people kind of describe being in the zone,
Mhm.
and you kind of in this process, and it's not always creative, by the way. Like I get a lot of this from running, for example,
Yes. Yes.
or I
Absolutely.
row here in London, and I get this very much this kind of repetitive feeling of
Mhm.
being on the water doing the same thing over and over again. And it's
Mhm.
kind of interesting because actually you could argue like doing the same thing over and over again, like running or rowing or whatever, is not very creative because you're kind of just repetitively, yeah, like you're doing the same thing. But I think what's important about that for me is, as you're saying, like it's kind of putting you in a phase where you're almost bringing that kind of monkey mind into like the moment, and
Mhm.
your subconscious is processing stuff.
Mhm.
I've had some of the best ideas I've had whilst I'm running
Yeah.
or in the shower. They talk about how like a lot of people have their best ideas in the shower because
Mhm.
actually you're not actually thinking about the thing you're thinking about.
Mhm.
You're
Mhm.
just kind of processing. You're letting the subconscious just do its thing. And if you don't give it that chance to do its thing, then you're not probably going to get to that really good idea. The second thing I was going to say is that, solution problems is definitely one aspect of creativity. But I almost want to sort of, for me, I just find that slightly narrow just because I think the role for creativity is far greater than, that, right? As we've touched on, there's self-expression, there's a way of thinking out of something, it gives you happiness. Like what's interesting is like even in this chat, we've like identified everything from happiness to how do you think yourself away from problem to how do you express yourself, which is important for your identity and all of those sorts of.
Mhm.
So actually to me that's kind of indicating that creativity is quite multifaceted, and it's not just a case of, oh yeah, like its ultimate purpose is to kind of find a solution, if that makes sense, because I
Mhm.
almost feel like that's a very myopic way of looking at it, and
Mhm.
actually you're only looking at part of the picture, and actually it's a bigger picture than that you're missing out on when you kind of look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. Are there any instances in your life that kind of changed or shifted your perspective so much that, you started thinking of something really differently?
You mean like beyond creativity or just in general? Just in general.
Anything in general,
um
the context of creativity, anything.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing is, I've always embraced my mortality, not in a kind of weird maudlin sense, but I think there's a sort of. I read a really interesting book by this writer called Ernest Becker, and it's called Denial of Death. And I know we're sort of veering into something else, but like basically, there were moments like that where the idea of like being existential, which I am actually, like I'm a very existential kind of person. For me, there has always been that kind of question of like, well, what's the point? Fundamentally, why? And I know you said you saw.
I'm with you on that because I've had those questions also midway. Like,
Yeah,
what is
yeah.
the purpose of all this kind of?
Well, you probably saw echoes of that when we were working together, when I was just probably
Yeah.
like, why? But why though?
Yes, I
This
did.
just the whole meme of like, why though?
Yeah.
And actually, it's sort of, there's no straightforward answer, right? And I'd say pivotal moment was sort of, there was a really interesting kind of line around, we're very, I'm going to butcher this, but like it's something along the lines of, we are masters of weaving significance
Hmm.
and webs of significance into ultimately things that are insignificant.
Hmm.
There's two ways of looking at it. You can either be very bogged down by that,
Hmm.
and you can say, oh, well, nothing matters. So why try? Why care? Why do anything? But there's this other way of looking at it where it's actually incredibly liberating. And it's sort of like, actually, because none of this, in a way, really, quote unquote, matters in that way,
Hmm.
just go for it. It kind of makes you feel like, yeah, whatever, like, let's go for it. Let's try it. So I think for me, that was quite pivotal when I was growing up. And I think it was wrapped up somewhere in my teenage angst. And I found multiple copies of Camus and like other existential writers in my parents' library. And I was trying to sort of
Mhm.
process this, but I was, way too young to understand what the hell Sartre and Camus were talking about. So all I remember from that is, God, like none of this actually has to matter.
Hmm.
Geez. And when you're kind of growing up, you think the stakes are really high,
Mhm.
and I just remember that being really liberating, where it's like, no, actually, the stakes aren't that high, and no one's really looking at you. Not saying like I felt like everyone's looking at me all the time, but
Hmm.
but I think as a teenager, you can actually feel that way, because I kind of understand that, because you're trying
Mhm.
to find your own identity and like all of this stuff. So you're very conscious of every move you make. Is
Hmm.
very much, I
That
think.
happens to a lot of people. It doesn't have to do with age at all.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're right. Like it transcends age, but I think it's particularly, I
Mhm.
mean, my hope is that by the time you get a bit older, hopefully you
Hmm.
have really kind of come to know yourself and are very secure in yourself, and you're actually not as liable to being sort of made to feel that way. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Of course that happens. And of course, I'm sure that happens very widely. But I can only talk about myself. Like, and I think I'm trying to come back to the creativity in a way where there's an element of being, to give yourself the license to create, or to think that I am going to do this. Well, you can create and you don't have to share it with anybody, but there is that sort of aspect. I definitely remember that I kind of made a pact with myself that at the end of the day, if I had to have a legacy project, which is something that actually Ernest Becker talks about,
Mhm.
um, I would love to create a piece of creative something, whether that's
Hmm.
film or something like that, that will live on beyond my existence, right? To
Mhm.
me, that was going to be my legacy project. I never
Mhm.
really warmed to having kids. I never really liked kids when I was a kid. So, whatever, I wasn't really that interested. I thought, okay, actually, and there was something about how creativity and cultural artifacts are
Mhm.
so important to people. And that's
Mhm.
something that's only grown, got older, that people use cultural artifacts all the time to talk to each other, like they
Mhm.
use in a language, like it means something to people, like
Mhm.
people draw on film references all the time to be able to
Mhm.
communicate something to other people, and that to me
Mhm.
is just extraordinary, because it just shows how important it is to people's lives.
Mhm.
And I guess I just had that realization that, and this is by no means being disparaging of these other people, so please, take that with a pinch of salt. But I was just like, I am not driven by having my name be the person who signs off a balance sheet for like a massive sort of company or whatever. Like that's just not my kick.
Hmm.
Some other people can get that kick. I just don't get that kick. But
Hmm.
for me, that kick was, that realization that when you're in a darkened room and people are like watching something you've made,
Hmm.
there's something magical about that, like all of these
Hmm.
people assemble to watch this kind of thing come to life,
Hmm.
and you
Hmm.
name it somewhere in there. There's just pure magic in
Hmm.
storytelling and film specifically, that
Hmm.
I just found incredibly fascinating. So I kind
Mhm.
of made a pact with myself that, I'll never kind of lose that, connection with film. And I love film, and I have a tattoo actually of a film reel on my right leg. Like it
Yes,
was
I was
anchored.
there when you were 20, I think.
I was quite young, yeah, yeah. So there was
Mm.
like a kind of decision that was like, I don't know if I'll make anything or not, but all I know is that I really respect this and I
Mhm.
really love this, and I really kind of elevate that as something
Mhm.
that is incredibly sort of Yeah, like my legacy project, if I can have one, if I can have the sort of privilege of making something like that, but whatever, I just love that art. And I guess the only other thing I can think of is, I mean, I think there were a series of pivotal things that may have suggested that I'm not terrible at it. And I think that sounds like a real kind of humble brag, but like, I think it was like the thing where I wrote something that ended up getting somewhere. Like, it's just things like that where you just, I think what I'm trying to say is like, you can have a natural inclination to something, but then if you don't get much feedback that you're actually quite good at it or something like that, even like remotely good at it, it can be quite discouraging,
Yeah.
right? And especially in the creative arts, like you put your soul into it. Like there's a
Mhm.
lot of other stuff that you can just kind of, it's not about you. Like it's
Mhm.
not your, like on some level, it's not about you. But you
Mhm.
ask any writer, and like you ask anyone who's kind of even performing, like musician, whatever,
Mhm.
there's part of your soul in everything you put out normally,
Mhm.
like if you really like care to.
Mhm.
And I know it can sound like very sort of whatever, it's out in the world, I don't really care, but the reality is like it is you. And when
Yeah.
people are really kind of disparaging of it and they hate it, and of course there'll be some people who hate what you do, it still hurts. Like
Yes.
it still hurts in a really different way to
Mhm.
someone saying someone didn't like my spreadsheet. You know what I mean? And again, I'm not like taking a dump on people doing spreadsheets, but it's a very different level of you in there, And when you
Mhm.
create art, or like you're creating kind of film, or you're writing something from your experiences or whatever, you're
Mhm.
putting a piece of you out there. And
Yeah.
that's really quite daunting. All I'm saying, like, yeah, there was this other pivotal moment where I had to come to peace with that. If I am going to kind of do stuff that goes out, there's a part of me that's just like, well, how do you deal
Mhm.
with everything from people not liking it to rejection to whatever? Like,
Mhm.
because again, like I said, failure is a big part of it, or even just sharing it with people, even sharing it with people and saying, God, like I've just like kind of on some level handed over a bit of my ego and a bit of my sort of whatever
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
someone else to judge.
Mhm.
And sure, they might not tell me what they really think, but I have chosen to do this.
Mhm.
So I think that's another hurdle, which you get comfortable with, I think, over
Mhm.
time. But it's definitely a hurdle.
Yeah, again, I think it comes back to this point of where when we put something out, sometimes even though we want to create, we might not be having that capacity to have that thought consistently. And
Right.
we will get inspired by other people's feedback or somebody saying that, hey, that's helping me think this way, or that's really helping me. And then we are motivated to do that, and then the creativity flows more. So it's really, really important also in that context to get feedback, positive feedback, to keep you going sometimes.
Yeah, and you're not quite sure like where do you stand on
Yeah.
the on the boundary of like
Yeah.
pure stubborn arrogance
Yeah.
to like actually I probably do need to change something
Yeah.
about something that I'm doing,
Yeah.
like you just don't, like it's such a hard balance, and like
Yeah.
it kind of goes back to that self-belief and self-confidence versus sharing with people and like what it means.
Also, I think, like, I don't know if you felt this, once I've started in this path of exploring creative things in my life, I have realized the importance of being kind to other people in the process. Because I felt this when I received some input from others, how I felt, how I got motivated. It really, I think, is important to be kind with our words and motivating to other people who are trying this journey. And I think that's made me more open to really giving those comments freely. Otherwise, sometimes we're not as free to really comment on it. Even if we like, forget about not liking. Even if we
Yeah.
like something, we just constrain ourselves and not share, right, our thought about it. I think I've become more free in sharing these things with people. Again, it creates this entire ecosystem and partnership with other people where we're all doing something nice, and I think it brings a lot of positivity also.
No, absolutely. I mean, I 100% agree with you actually. Like a lot of my job also actually involves working with people to realize certain creative things, and like, and at the end of the day, part of my job is giving feedback, and part of my job is to say, well, this is in like, I write briefs that people have to kind of answer to, and it is sort of my job to sort of say, well, this isn't really on brief, and sometimes that feedback can be a little bit brutal,
Mhm.
as in what I have to say might not be very savory,
Mhm.
right? but you're totally right in that the energy of the people you're working with
Mm-hmm.
has to, you have to motivate them to feel like they want to keep going. Like if you
Yeah.
kind of do it in a way, and you're absolutely right that the language and words really matter, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the words and the way you kind of phrase your feedback is super, super important,
Mm-hmm.
especially on the back of what I just said, in terms of there's, no matter how transactional you are
Mm-hmm.
about your creativity, there's definitely a piece of you that's going out there. Like no matter, like it's kind of like denial to say that it isn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know anyone who's so cold about that to say, yeah, whatever, like I don't care, yeah, go ahead. But you're totally right that you need to foster, as you say, like an ecosystem of people who are willing to stick with the task, run with it, stick to the course of, we're going to get there. Like,
Mm.
and that vision and that North Star sometimes important. And actually, the problem is, like, a lot of this stuff does end up being a combination of subjectivity to objectivity, and how do you not take something personally as someone who is, putting something out there, and actually that's not just creative, right? Like that's
Yeah.
anyone
Yeah.
doing any kind of job, genuinely.
Yeah.
Like anything that's being said that sort of suggests that what you did isn't really matching expectations is
Mm.
unpleasant. Like that is unpleasant, and you
Mm.
don't have to be making an art scamp or like writing a piece of copy for that. You can be doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
And when someone says, well, actually you didn't really reach these kind of expectations, didn't do these things, it is unpleasant and it's kind of bad. You're absolutely right that, like, kind of making it about, I think, kindness alongside
Mm-hmm.
sort of not being subjective but being as
Mm-hmm.
objective about it,
Yeah.
has, at least for me, helped me. I think basically at the end of the day, people need to buy into the fact that you want to help them make better work.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't engender that, then they'll always reject you and they'll always be suspicious of where you're coming from. So I
Mm-hmm.
think if there's a kind of shared ethos
Mm.
of, some of this is going to be a little bit unpleasant, some of this is going to be very pleasant, and at the end of the day, we're here for the same purpose. We're all pulling towards the same goal, and the
Mm-hmm.
goal is really good work.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think people, aside from certain personality traits, will sort of be receptive to that stuff. And of course, you want to foster a culture of kindness, but equally a culture that is accountable, and a culture that can tell what it needs to say. Like it needs to be open as well, because
It's
going
not
back to,
superficial comments. I
yeah,
think in anything, underlying fact is there should be honesty and genuine feedback also. It's just not like, even if you don't like something, you just don't say like, oh, I love it. And like,
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
that.
It
So,
needs to come from a good place, and it's also needs to be going to a good place, if that
yeah,
makes sense.
exactly.
If it's not coming from a good place, and if it's not really headed towards a good place, then you're in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. I am like really looking forward to whatever you're going to do for your legacy project or legacy film. I know you've been into films for so long. That is the first thing I remember about you when I think of you, because I think one of the first conversations we've had, you've told me about your love for filmmaking. And
Yeah.
so I'm really, really looking forward to that.
I mean, we'll see. Massive trust. We'll see. We'll see where. Yeah, I mean, hopefully my legacy project is something that doesn't put you to sleep. But
It will not. It'll be interesting, I am
we'll
sure.
see. We'll see what
Yeah.
happens. This has also kind of shown me how underneath the surface creativity is really, really helped me and help. I mean, it's so important, right? And I
Mhm.
think that's what's really been illuminating about this conversation, is that it can be so many different things. It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife, really,
Mm.
for me,
Mm.
or has been in my life. Like
Mm.
it's definitely helped me in so many different ways,
Mhm.
and that's such a boring way to talk about creativity. But I genuinely think that, like, I think it
Mhm.
is such a just the kind of ultimate sort of tool to have in some
Mhm.
ways that
Mhm.
can really help you out lots of stuff. So no, I mean, I've come away from this really much more sort of in touch with God. I really do admire creativity, and I
Mhm,
really love it,
mhm.
and
Yeah.
I really love it.
Hopefully we are putting out something that others can appreciate and reflect on also, but beyond that, I think it's been a good conversation for the two of us to learn and think about things in a different perspective. So in my life at different points, I've been shown that, there is a possibility that you can think differently. You don't have to think about anything like everybody else is thinking. There's so many ways. So you've been one of those people who've showed me that also.
Wow, thank
So I
you.
appreciate that.
I've always, and not to get all soppy, but I was talking about this with a friend earlier. We had lunch, and I just said I have so much admiration for your own guts, like to kind of just do. I mean, I'd say like you kind of counterbalance the idea of why not in a way that I probably would be a bit more risk averse. You are much more sort of, yes, we can do it, yes, we, you was so much more sort of let to do it, and I really really admired and really learned from that, and actually the flip side of trying to be creative is crippling insecurity and crippling kind of not putting anything out there because you're kind of like, oh my god, it's not perfect, it's not perfect.
Mhm.
And I think what was really liberating and kind of I learned so much, and I was so lucky to have learned from you, is not overthinking it, like in a way that's and I mean that in the best positive way, like just kind of doing it with like due diligence, like no one's saying don't do it, but I really admire that you got it done, like you had stuff, like it was tangible, and I can't tell you how many people have thought about doing half of the
Mm.
stuff you've done and just never done it.
Mm.
And I think that's really, really interesting and powerful in its very own kind of way. Like it's so inspiring because half of the time it's just doing the thing,
Mm.
just giving birth to stuff that actually exists. And I really will always cherish that because it's such a good learning, and I'm such a fan of that. So thank you so much for
Oh, thank you.
teaching that.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's a good place to end our conversation today. And thank you again, Nikhil, for accepting this invitation and being a
No,
part of
thanks
this
for having me
conversation.
over, Neelima. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you for listening to today's reflections. If you would like to connect with me, please visit bluishmuse.com. Until next time, namaste.